Okay, so welcome. Like Renee said, we will have, or we're expecting a couple of more people to join in, but we will try to do our best to catch them up. So I just want to say good evening to everybody. We're going to get the session started on Township of Springwater's Ward Boundary Review for 2024. My name is Jack Amendolia. If we go to the next slide, I'm a managing partner at a firm called Watson and Associates. I'm joined tonight by my colleague Josh Valenti, who's a senior project coordinator at Watson. And we also do these studies along with other people at the Watson team. We're also joined on these studies, couldn't be here tonight, but helps us out with these studies, Dr. Robert Williams, who's a specialist in municipal affairs. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing here tonight. So, like I said, the township is embarking on a ward boundary review. What the consultant team has been tasked with is to look at the township's current ward boundaries and to provide an opinion on whether the existing ward boundaries are continuing to provide effective representation for the citizens of Springwater. And if we determine that they're not, to come up with alternative ward boundaries that the consultant team feels may provide council with a better alternative. Ultimately, it's council's decision. We provide them with the information, and we'll talk about what that information includes tonight. And ultimately, if they want to make a change, they do so by passing a bylaw. So tonight, a couple of things that we want to do. We want to talk a little bit about what a ward boundary review is. We'll talk a little bit about some of the legislation that surrounds the process, and as we'll come to find out in a couple of minutes, there's not a lot of legislation or a lot of prescribed legislation. So we'll talk a little bit about how we've come up with our process. Part of that is the guiding principles, and we'll discuss how that criteria really tries to shape our process and tries to shape the analysis to determine whether we think the wards are sufficient or not. And really, why we're doing this. As part of that process, we not only want to provide an opinion based on some of the things we just talked about in the legislation and guiding principles, but we also want to hear what the residents of Springwater think. We want to hear whether you think you do have good access to your council, whether you think that there are an appropriate number of wards and that the populations of those wards make sense. So a big part of this process is really trying to listen to what the residents are telling us and to take all of that feedback and try to create some new ward designs. So go to the next slide. We'll provide a little bit of background, a little bit of context to how we got to where we are right now. So the township of Springwater was incorporated way back in 1994. When the township was incorporated, it was largely the system that you have now. It was a 5-ward system, had a mayor, it had a deputy mayor, and that system was in place, same that was created in 1994. Exact same system was in place all the way to 2013, 2014. At that time, the township did look at the wards, and it was an internal administration conducted review. And there were some adjustments made to wards 2, 3, and 5. And then fast forward to today, we still do have the same system in 2024 as 2013-14. So that's what we're going to evaluate and look at. And just a couple of other tidbits in there. In 2019 and again in 2022 and a little bit again today, the county continues to look at its own composition as well. When they have looked at their own composition, so far there have been no changes made with regard to the representation of lower tier on county council. So right now you have a mayor and deputy mayor, both elected at large, and both are your municipal representation on county council. So no change to that as of now. So that's the premise that we're working under in 2024. If we go to the next slide. So we're working under the assumption that no change to the county. So you're still going to have a mayor and a deputy mayor that are required to sit on county council. The mayor and deputy mayor are both elected at large, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. And like I said, really from the inception of Springwater, aside from that review that was done in 2013-14, you have 5 wards and 1 ward or 1 councillor per ward. So what is known as a symmetrical system, 1 councillor per ward. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about a little bit further on the composition. and a little bit of the legislation. So the minimum size, and this is where the legislation, dictates some things, and in others, it's provides a lot of flexibility for the municipality or for ultimately council to determine what it looks like. So what does the legislation says? Legislation says that the minimum size of a council in Ontario has to be five. So doesn't say how big it can be. It doesn't give any kind of numbers on, if you have this size of population, you should have this number of counselors. It just says the minimum size you should have is five, and it just says that the head of count and one of those five has to be the head of council or the mayor. Like I was saying, there's no real clear principles. There's no standards. There's no formulas to say, how big your council should be. And in a couple of minutes, we'll look at a slide that just looks at the different councils just throughout Simcoe County. And if we look throughout Ontario, there's even more variance, but we'll look at some of the council sizes throughout Simcoe County. So no real guidelines to help us. So right now, like I said, the only legislative reference is it has to be a minimum of five. One has to be the head of council. So Spring Waters Council is currently seven, so two above the minimum. If we go to the next slide, I'll provide a little bit of summary of what you see at the bottom of that slide. So it talks about, like I said, the different sizes of councils throughout the county of Simcoe, and you can see there's quite a few municipalities in the county, quite a different population or quite a range of populations. I think as low as about 10,000, 11,000 in some municipalities, all the way as much as 43,000 in Innisfil, about 43,000 in Bradford, West Gwillimbury. So quite a range of population. If you look at the column showing area, it shows the areas of each municipality in square kilometers. So quite a range even in some of the sizes of the places. So if we look at Springwater, highlighted in gray near the bottom of this chart, population, and this is based on 2021 census populations. Population in 2021, about 21,700. Area, about a little under 536 square kilometers. Like we said, council made up of 7 members. That includes mayor and deputy mayor. And the average population per member, again, including the mayor and deputy mayor, about 3,100. And it's a ward system, not an at-large system. You should have at-large or wards. So that's what's going on in Springwater. When we look at the average of all the municipalities in Simcoe County, Springwater is pretty much bang on in a couple of those categories. In terms of average population, it's pretty much right there with the average. A lot larger than the average area at 536 as opposed to 290 average. So definitely more area to consider. The average council size across Simcoe County, about 7.7, so pretty much on par there. And the average population per member across the county, about 2,800. Springwater slightly higher at 3,100. And again, from a wards and at-large perspective, the majority of the municipalities in Simcoe County are on a ward system, same as Springwater, but there are, I think, about 5 quick count that are still at large. So again, that's really to say that Springwater fits into the average when we look across Simcoe County, but there's no hard and fast rules in terms of population, like I said, or how big or size of council or some of those other things. So that's a little bit about what Springwater is looking like right now in terms of size of council. A little bit what I just touched on a couple of minutes ago. So I mentioned in that timeline and that historic timeline that the county had in the past and continues to look at its own governance and its own composition of the county council. So in 2022, they reviewed the composition of council. The aim of, or at least the focus of that review in 2022 was to see if they could reduce the size of county council. And I think there were some recommendations regarding reducing the size and just going to mayor as opposed to mayor and deputy mayor. But in 2022, the county declined to implement that change. So like I said earlier, we're still under that premise that it's going to remain as mayor and deputy mayor representing municipalities on county council. A little bit of a wrench in there is that, while the county looked at composition, like I said, in I think 19 and 2022, In late 2023, the province is actually in the process of looking at certain counties and certain regions across the province and looking at how those regional and county governments are governed. So there is a committee, a standing committee that is in process right now, that is looking at some of those things. Again, based on the timing of this study and based on the timing of what the committee is looking at, we don't think it's going to have an impact on any recommendations that we make as part of this review. But it may have some implications if they make a change going forward. But honestly, we're just going to have to cross that bridge when we get there. Okay, so a little bit of, in the next slide, a little bit of the legislative framework, or I like to joke, lack thereof. So there's not a lot of guidance in the legislation in terms of award boundary review or some of the other things we talked about with regard to composition of council. So I touched on some of these already, so I'll be fairly quick. But in the Municipal Act, there are a couple of things that the Act authorizes a lower municipality to do. So I talked about the first one, define the size of council, right? So I said the only thing it says it has to be a minimum of 5. One has to be the head of council, but ultimately it's up to the municipality to determine what size fits to their uniqueness. Determine how council, other than the mayor, will be elected. So like we said, the mayor, head of council, has to be elected at large. Everything else is really up to council in terms of how it could be elected. Even deputy mayor, in some places, it's elected at large. In some places, it's selected from within one of the existing council members. So that's up to council. And it can divide or redivide the municipality into wards or dissolve the existing wards. So what does that mean? If you have an at-large system, council can decide to go to a ward system. If you have a ward system, council can go back to an at-large system, or council can decide to redivide the existing wards into more wards, or change the boundaries, which is exactly what we're doing, or could be doing as part of this study. So those are that's what the legislation enacts or authorizes a lower tier municipality to do. The first two, defining the size of the council, determining how council can be elected, are not appealable. So if council makes that determination, no one can appeal it. You can't appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal that you don't like the decision or the size of council. However, the last one, dealing with dividing or redividing the municipality into wards, the exercise that we're embarking on, that is an appealable action. So that can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So if a citizen does not like or thinks that maybe perhaps some of the guiding principles weren't followed correctly, then they have an appeal available to them with regard to that last point, dividing the municipality. Again, really quickly, because we touched on this already, no schedule, no process, no real criteria that's been established for electoral reviews in Ontario, and no timelines either, right? So, like we said, in this case, the township was incorporated in '94, didn't make a change until 2013-14, made a change there. Now we're in 24-25. We work with a lot of places that were incorporated at the same time or earlier who haven't looked at their awards at all in 30, 40, or sometimes longer. So there's no schedule. There's nothing that the legislation says when you hit this population, if you've grown this much, you have to look at your awards. Federally, provincially, it's a little bit different. It is based on criteria and an established timeline. In other provinces like Nova Scotia, I think they have to review it. Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's every 8 years or 10 years or every couple of elections. So there's other places that definitely have more legislative guidance and parameters. Not the case in Ontario. Some of it is good, right? Some of it allows municipalities, I think, to cater to, like I said, their uniqueness. It allows for some flexibility. From a consultant perspective, it allows us to, establish some processes. So I think part of it is good in terms of not being perhaps too fixed or too legislated. The other question, though, that as I'm explaining this, that citizens might ask is, okay, so how do you then set those guiding principles? How do you set some of the criteria that you use? So it's a bunch of different ways. I mean, it's from doing these studies multiple times over several years, and just the experience that we've developed. It's partly because it is something that's appealable. It is also based on if we do them and do them successfully, we try to use and apply those same principles. In places where we do get appealed, we try to listen to that feedback in terms of what caused that appeal. A big part of it too is case law, right? Over the years, a lot of these, not necessarily ours, but just over time, cases or ward boundary reviews have been appealed. And what has come out of the case law has largely established the guiding principles and some of the criteria that we use today. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what those guiding principles are. So, and I'll talk in a minute about, it's not always possible as I explain them. I hope this makes a little bit more sense, but it's not always possible to achieve all of these guiding principles. Some of them are almost a push-pull in terms of how they balance each other out. And this is something that, I talk at the beginning about ensuring that we have public engagement and listening to what the public tells us. This is, to me, probably one of the most important elements of feedback that we want, because it's going to really help us when we start to design new boundaries and new systems. The feedback that we get with regard to the guiding principles is really going to help us, focus in on certain options. So I'll talk about some of these guiding principles. So the first one, and probably, in our experience, the strongest driver of why you do a ward boundary review, it's representation by population. As much as possible, you want to ensure that residents are equitably represented, that they have equal and equitable access to their elected representatives, and that the wards have reasonable or reasonably equal population. You don't want one councillor who has 40 or 50% more constituents and population deal with than perhaps the other 3 or 4 councillors. That doesn't create balance. That's not going to create an equitable access for the residents of that ward compared to some of those other wards. So that's really where we start. We want to ensure that as much as we can, we want to have rep by pop. The next one is population and electoral trends. So one element is ensuring that the ward populations are equal based on today's populations, but especially in a place like Springwater and in a place like Simcoe County, we know that there has been significant growth, and we know that there is going to continue to be sustained and significant growth in many, many areas. So when we look at representation by population, we want to look at the existing, but we also want to look at what the future populations are going to look like. The intention of these reviews is really to do this for a couple of elections, so that this or the ward recommendations we make incorporate what the future growth is going to be. And in some cases, you may even grow into a ward system that works when it looks at some of those future population trends. The other one we talk about is means of communication and accessibility. So as much as possible, we want to ensure that wards have some connection, right? We want to ensure that different places throughout the ward reflect similar patterns, similar transportation patterns. We tend to look at even things like school boundaries. We look at how school communities or rec centers are organized, sports teams, just to ensure that as much as possible, we can group sort of those like-minded areas and areas that already have connections with each other in the same ward as much as possible. Geographical and topographical features. So this one means that the more that you can identify where your ward stops and where another ward begins is going to help with some of these other things we're talking about, right? In some cases, the lines don't necessarily follow a river or a main road. So it's really difficult to understand even where those boundaries are. So again, as much as possible, where we can use what already exists, whether it's man-made or natural, and where they're identifiable, we try to do that as much as we can. And the last one, communities of interest, to me, look, these are all important, right? All these guiding principles are criteria that we try to reflect. And when we design what I think as the perfect kind of ward system, we really try to ensure that all of these are met. But there's definitely, I think, a couple that are more important, right? And I think like I touched on rep by pop, and that's not my opinion, but that's case law and procedure and experience. We know that one. But this last one, communities of interest, is almost as important. And when we talk about communities of interest, somewhat similar to what I was talking about with connection and communication and accessibility. But when we talk about communities of interest, really we're trying to recognize that the township of Springwater is not just a township of Springwater, but it's also made up of villages and former townships and former areas that are recognizable. We always talk and sometimes you ask people, I'm from Hamilton, right? But when you ask someone in Hamilton that lives in Ancaster or Dundas, where they're from, they don't say Hamilton, even though it's an amalgamated city. They still say Dundas, and I'm sure it's the same thing in Springwater, where you're likely to say Midhurst rather than Springwater or something like that. So we want to recognize that as much as we can, right? We won't if we we really and we don't know how it's going to shake out, but we want to try to avoid doing things like having a community of interest split into 3 or 4 wards, right? So this is what I talk about at the beginning, where sometimes it's a push-pull. We want to get representation by population, right? We want to have as equitable populations as we can for every ward. But sometimes, especially when you think about some of the urban centers and former recognizable communities of interest that have a lot of the population, sometimes you want to get population right. You can't have, an urban center in one ward because it throws all the population out of whack. So then you may have to divide up that community of interest to get the right population. Or you might have to say, you know what? I can live with this population imbalance within reason, because I think that having this ward recognize this community of interest trumps the rep by population, or at least slightly. So that's what I mean. It's ultimately trying to find what the balance is for the residents of Springwater, right? We can tell you based on case law and what's important that your wards have. But ultimately, the priority of these guiding principles largely comes from the research and the feedback that we get from you. At the very bottom, ensuring effective voter representation. We like to call this sort of the overarching principle, right? We have all these guiding principles that we use as guidelines and as criteria to determine what we think a good ward is or what a good ward design is. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is ensure effective voter representation. And that's done by trying to achieve all of the guiding principles in some degree. So that's really our or a summary, I think, of the criteria that we're going to use to evaluate the existing system and also to evaluate any kind of designs that we may come up with or alternatives we may come up with to replace what you have today. Go to the next slide. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this. So, we're doing a ward boundary review. Our scope is to look at the existing wards and determine whether we need to make changes to those boundaries to achieve the guiding principles that we just talked about. But I did want to raise wards versus no wards or an at-large system because it does come up. It's come up in feedback. Everything is on the table, right? That when we're looking at this, if we hear strongly from the public that they think an at-large system may be more reflective of their needs, we would definitely analyze it and come up with any kind of recommendations, just the same as any other option that we would come up with. So I just wanted to raise that quickly. So again, just to reiterate, so obviously a ward system is what you have now. It's what the majority of municipalities in Simcoe County have. Councillors elected, like I said, in specific areas. Reflects population distribution. It allows for the community of interest that I just spoke about to be identified in different wards. Obviously, an at-large system, all officials are elected on the same basis throughout the township. When we look at some pros and cons, one con I would say from a campaign perspective is distance, especially when we look at a place like Springwater, and we noted how much larger it was than many of the other municipalities in Simcoe County. So that could be tough to campaign. It can be in certain systems when we look at large systems. Sometimes some parts of the municipality may not be recognized or may not get an adequate voice. However, on the pro side, in terms of what we see and what we hear from the public as well, electors get to choose from a larger pool of candidates. So there's pros and cons to every single one, but ultimately we're going to listen and think or listen to what the residents think, and then provide some recommendations and opinions based on that. So before I turn it over to Josh, he's going to get into some of the review process, some of our preliminary observations, and then finish off tonight about different ways that the public can get involved. I'll just summarize in terms of a couple of things that we're trying to figure out as part of this review. So what I said at the very beginning, ultimately, as a consultant team, the first thing we got to decide or got to try to determine is, does the present electoral structure serve the citizens of Springwater? It's important to note that at this point, we're doing a review. It doesn't mean that we're going to come up with changes. It doesn't mean that we're going to make any changes. It means that we're looking at the existing system, and we're going to provide some summary and some observations of the existing system. So that's step one. And ultimately, it's what we just talked about in the guiding principles. What question are we trying to answer? We're trying to say, does the present system provide fair and effective representation? And then if the answer, like I was saying before, happens to be no, then we have to say, would an alternative system provide better representation? And that last point's important too, is it's sometimes we look at it and say, yeah, you know what, it's not really working in a perfect way, and we're not achieving all of the guiding principles. But sometimes we go to redesign the system, and sometimes you have to live with what you have to live for. So just to say that at this point, it's a review. We're going to audit, we're going to provide some observations. And if we think that an alternate system might be able to provide better able to hit some of those guiding principles, then we'll come up with some options. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to pass it over to Josh. Josh?
Great, thanks, Jack. So in the next couple of slides, we'll just run through initially the process, how we got to where we are today, and as Jack said, what we're trying to get at, provide you a few ways to get involved just beyond listening here today, and what's to come. So we initially started this project in spring of 2024. Dr. Williams and the Watson team started to conduct some background research and information on how really we got to where we are today. How were the words prepared? What was the driving purpose behind the current system that we have today? And really, does it work? And to answer those questions, we had a workshop with council in spring of 2024, followed by council member interviews and senior staff to really get an insight on what works and what works from their view of today's system. All that really can be formed and reviewed through the background reports, which are available online on the springwater.ca/ward WBR website. And in June here, we are doing our public engagement session. So we had 2 in-person sessions earlier this week. This is our last virtual session here today, which will be available online for further review. And from these sessions, we do have a follow-up survey. So please visit that website, review the materials, listen to the videos that are there, and engage in that survey as well. Throughout the summer months here, we're going to review that engagement information that we've seen and heard from the feedback, and try to develop some preliminary options, which we then will come back out to the public in fall of 2024 in a similar manner, in person and virtual sessions in the fall, with a few different alternatives, maps to really look at and engage and determine what works for the community. From that engagement, we'll finalize those options in the winter and provide a report with alternatives. Usually this is 2 or more alternatives, and a recommendation to council to help them make their informed decision on next steps and how this may change or adjust the ward boundaries for the upcoming 2026 election. So the current ward system right now, we have 5 wards, as we can see on the map on the left-hand side here. Starting with wards 1 and 2 in the north, and 3 in the central Springwater, and then 4, 5 on the south. And along with that, we do have population numbers by ward from 2020 or 2011 to 2021. And as we can see in 2011, almost perfect parity. The green numbers we see there are within that 5%, plus or minus 5% of the optimal range. And that optimal range is really the average of those, the population divided by the number of wards. So in 2011, the optimal range is about 18,200. And 2 of those wards fall within 5%, and 3 were just outside that 5%, but still within that 25% threshold that Jack had referred to earlier. Come 2021, we noticed that the population grew from 18,200 to 21,700. And with that growth, a lot of that growth actually developed within Ward 4. And as we can see here in 2021, Ward 4 is now beyond that 25% and highlighted in the OR plus and that darker red color, being almost 1.5 times that of the optimal range of 21,700 there. So we can start to see some discrepancies as we have grown, even from 2011 to 2021, but we are continuing to grow as a municipality. And with that being said, a lot of that growth is anticipated in that southern region, in that Midhurst and wards 4 and 5 areas. So as Ward 4 has already grown out of parity, it will continue to grow out of parity. But while we look at Ward 5, which is just below that parity at 91% of the optimal range, we'll start to see that ward again move into parity, and depending on the amount of growth developed by that 2-term scenario, it might actually fall outside on the higher end of parity. And as those 2 wards develop, wards 1 through 3 are seeing some limited growth and maybe some even declines moving forward. So they will start to fall out of parity on that lower side as well as we move forward. And again, this is just really one of those reflections of those, or I guess 2 of those guiding principles of population parity for today, but also looking at population parity of the future, looking out two wards, 2 election cycles, and how can we start to balance that from where we know the growth is happening. And this can be related to a couple of alternatives. Do we want to maybe catch up and divide these wards equally among the population today, or look to maybe divide them and equalize those population parities for tomorrow in the future? And that's one of those push and pulls of those guiding principles that we are looking to engage and understand a little bit more as we move through this process. From a public consultation process, again, a lot of this is available online, and you might have seen it on social media or through media printouts, and I believe it's on the radio as well. But this is all really trying to engage and bring the public to provide feedback for what we can then bring into phase 2 of the study to prepare those options. Get online. There's an online and print engagement. We have surveys available. Those are open until July 5th. We are wrapping up the first round of public engagement sessions, but we'll be back in the fall with those maps to be reviewed and provide engagement. And there's a number of reports available online, backgrounders. We do have four out there that really can shed some light on where we are today, how we got here, and what's to expect in the coming days for this study. So that website is springwater.ca/WBR. Again, please get on there, fill out that survey. We do have a engagement video there. It's a quick 3-minute video, but it sheds some light into what really this ward boundary review is about, and what we hope to capture and provide to inform council in the coming months. So again, get online, read those materials, be willing to ask questions, and hopefully feel free to share this information and engage your family, friends, and your community as well. Direct them to the project website. Let them know that we are looking to propose alternatives to the existing ward system, and that their feedback is really valuable in our process to do that. So with that being said, we do have a link to the survey on the bottom there, but again, there is a click version available on the springwater.ca/WBR website. And from here, I'll throw it back over to Jack.
Thanks for that, Josh. So we're just going to conclude up with a couple of next steps, but I just do want to mention to those on the webinar tonight, if anyone has any questions that they want to ask tonight, please use the chat feature. It is being moderated. So yeah, please just let us any comments, any questions, please put it into the chat feature and we'll address it. So just in terms of next steps, where do we go from here? So really, we try to think about this ward boundary review in almost two phases. The first phase is really a research phase, where as the consultant team, we work with your municipality staff. Like Josh said, we interview the counselors, the mayor, the deputy mayor. We do this public engagement, all the different online tools that Josh spoke about, really to try to understand spring water. The counselors and staff help us ground truth some of our assumptions. So that's really the first phase, is we walk away and think, okay, what do we think and what have we heard about the existing system? And we take all of that and then we go off and like we both talked about earlier, we go off and we try to come up with some, if we determine that there's a necessity, we come off or we go off and try to design some alternative systems. So that's really the next step for us, is over the summer months, we're going to go back and take all the things that we learned and come up with some alternatives. The intention is to do another round of engagement, very similar to what we just did this first round, public open houses in person, as well as virtual. There'll be lots of things on the web, lots of maps. There'll probably be maps in the municipal office if anyone wants to go down and check those out. So we'll, through our engagement, let everybody know sort of when those dates and when those things will be available. But that's really the next step, is to play with those designs and come back to the public and you tell us again what you think about some of the options that we came up with. We take that feedback and then come up with some recommendations to council. Like Josh was saying, that recommendation ideally is supposed to be for 2 municipal election cycles and beyond if we can. And then if council determines that they like some of the options, they could pick one. They can ask us to go back and combine something. They can create their own hybrid option. At that point, it really becomes up to council what they want to do with those recommendations. However, if they want to then make a change to the boundaries, council would then enact the bylaw to do so. So I'm going to stop there. I did notice that there was a question or a comment that was in the chat. Oh, so Roy M asks, what is the projected population in Ward 4 and Ward 5 over the next 10 years? Roy, thank you for that question. That's what we're about to embark on right now over the next couple of months. So Josh works with the municipality, with their planning department, and looks at all the projected growth that's expected. We apply population yield to those to come up with a population forecast. So as we work on that, as we come up with new wards, that's the type of information that we'll start to release on the municipality's website over the summer, in terms of what the populations of the existing wards at this point are going to look like when we incorporate some of the projections. So thanks again, Roy. Any other comments or questions that anyone wants to pop into the chat?
I guess, Jack, just to point out one thing on the bylaw that gets enacted, that is the means that would be appealable as well. So if we do make a recommendation and anything alterations come out of council, that is the opportunity for that appeal to come into play.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And maybe just to add to that from a timing perspective. So any change, if council decides to make a change to a ward boundary, to a boundary, those changes have to be made prior to December 31st of the year before the election. So any changes would have to be made by December 31st of 2025. In this case, we're well before that. If council decides to make a change, it would be well before that. And we always account, like Josh says, for any adequate time where it may be appealed. The hope is that, we're pretty good at this and we haven't been appealed too many times yet. So the hope is we try to provide and give council a system or options that won't, but like Josh said, we build that into the process if it does happen. Okay, unless there's any other comments or questions, I think I'll just give it a second and see if anything pops up. But while we're waiting for that, I just wanted to thank any of the attendees that joined us for the webinar tonight. I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but this session was recorded as well, so it is going to go up like all the other materials Josh spoke about. This will also go up on the municipality's website and can be viewed at a later date. So for those who did attend, if you know anyone who wanted to but couldn't make it, please let them know that they'll have the availability to look at this. So with that, I think on my behalf, I will just say thank you and good night to everybody. Thanks, Renee, and thanks, Josh, and thanks everyone for coming to listen tonight.
Thank you, everyone.